The atmosphere inside the executive conference room carried the suffocating scent of expensive imported cologne intermingled with the undeniable stench of catastrophic corporate decisions. That distinct sensory combination remains the single most prominent detail etched into my memory from the precise moment Julian Croft locked his cold, unblinking eyes onto mine and delivered his verdict. He leaned forward slightly, resting his perfectly manicured hands on the polished mahogany surface, and stated, "Effective immediately, we are terminating your position as Vice President of Engineering." I am Oliver Vance, 54 years of age, and I had just been unceremoniously terminated in a room packed with executives who probably could not spell the word firmware if someone generously spotted them the first 6 letters. Silence descended upon the space like a lead weight. Not a single person dared to move. 14 high-level executives sat completely frozen around that expansive table, and the only sound piercing the heavy quiet was the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock positioned against the far wall. Julian did not so much as blink. He simply remained seated in his meticulously tailored charcoal suit, his hands clasped together in a posture that suggested he was finalizing a lucrative commercial real estate transaction rather than abruptly destroying a dedicated professional's lifelong career. From his heavily skewed perspective, I was certainly not the dedicated architect who had sacrificed 11 grueling years building Vanguard Defense Systems' entire autonomous drone navigation platform completely from the ground up. In his eyes, I was merely an expensive line item on a quarterly spreadsheet, a bosom financial liability that he could swiftly eliminate to make his margin optimizations look appropriately spectacular for the upcoming board meeting. I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily, the muscles straining against the sheer audacity of the situation. My hands instinctively wanted to grip the leather armrests of my chair, flip the massive wooden table over, and loudly articulate exactly what I thought about his utterly detached, spreadsheet-driven management philosophy. The sheer disrespect of his approach violated every tenet of fiduciary duty, prioritizing short-term cosmetic financial improvements over the long-term technological viability of the enterprise. But I maintained my composure. I slowly pushed my chair back, stood up to my full height, meticulously straightened my silk tie, and locked eyes with every single face observing me in that room. When absolute silence had once again settled over them, I uttered a single, solitary word: appreciated. A few individuals shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone near the back coughed nervously. They most likely assumed the shock of the moment had caused me to completely lose my mind, or perhaps they genuinely believed that my spirit had been entirely broken by their callous corporate maneuver. However, none of those highly compensated individuals possessed even the slightest inkling of what that specific word actually signified in the grander scheme of our impending legal reality. You see, Julian Croft was 38 years old and possessed a freshly minted Master of Business Administration degree from a prestigious Ivy League institution. His uncle, Edward Croft, held a powerful seat on Vanguard's board of directors and concurrently managed Apex Capital Partners, the aggressive private equity firm that had successfully spearheaded our massive Series B funding round several years prior. Julian had never designed a complex circuit board in his entire life. He had never spent tortuous weeks debugging an erratic navigation algorithm. He had never endured 3 consecutive sleepless nights desperately attempting to force a heavy autonomous drone to maintain stable hover parameters in 40-knot crosswinds. Yet, he possessed an endless vocabulary of corporate buzzwords. He absolutely adored phrases like operational efficiency, synergistic alignment, and aggressive headcount rationalization. The man spoke about highly classified defense technology as if he were aggressively peddling cheap vacation timeshares to gullible tourists. My background stood in stark contrast. I had been deeply entrenched in the demanding field of aerospace and defense engineering for 27 long years. My journey commenced as a junior systems engineer precisely when advanced satellite-guided munitions were fundamentally altering the global landscape of modern warfare. I spent 6 demanding years meticulously learning how encrypted satellite communication systems function in actual combat scenarios. I proudly served as a core member of the elite engineering team responsible for developing some of the very first autonomous flight control systems designed specifically for advanced military applications. I had personally witnessed three separate competing defense companies completely collapse into bankruptcy during severe federal budget reductions roughly a decade ago. On one particularly memorable Tuesday, half of my engineering colleagues were abruptly laid off without warning and escorted out of the building by armed security personnel before Friday afternoon. That traumatizing experience taught me the single most critical lesson of my entire professional existence. If you possess the intellect and the drive to build something possessing immense, world-changing value, you must ensure you maintain absolute, undeniable ownership of the foundational keys to that kingdom. When I originally joined Vanguard Defense Systems many years ago, they were nothing more than a scrappy, underfunded startup consisting of 12 exhausted engineers, sharing a collective dream of manufacturing truly autonomous drones capable of executing highly dangerous commercial infrastructure inspections. We targeted high-voltage power transmission lines, massive cross-country oil pipelines, and towering cellular network structures. I personally architected their entire revolutionary navigation platform entirely from scratch. I named it the Aeropath system, a massive suite of highly proprietary algorithmic sequences capable of successfully flying a heavy drone through a dense, unpredictable forest of live electrical wires in absolute zero visibility, while mapping the entire surrounding environment in real time with astonishing millimeter precision. By the time Julian fired me, the system was managing aerial inspections for over 60% of the pipeline operators in the nation. What Julian completely failed to understand, and what the majority of those highly paid executives in that opulent conference room never even bothered to learn, was the intricate legal reality of our underlying technology. 3 years prior, when Vanguard Defense Systems was violently hemorrhaging cash during a severe venture capital drought, the board of directors began seriously discussing the possibility of selling off various operational divisions just to keep the lights on. It was during that terrifying period of financial uncertainty that I executed a maneuver that was both entirely legal and brilliantly strategic. I had meticulously restructured the core Aeropath patents into a completely separate legal entity named Vance Autonomous Technologies, a corporation that I fully controlled as the sole proprietor. This complex corporate maneuver was fully documented, thoroughly vetted by multiple prominent corporate law firms, and ultimately approved unanimously by the exact same board of directors that had just passively watched Julian hand me my final termination letter. The master licensing agreement between Vanguard and Vance Autonomous Technologies was structured meticulously. It stipulated that Vanguard could continue utilizing the highly advanced navigation technology indefinitely, but only under the strict condition that the original chief architect, myself, maintained a continuous, active leadership role within the company. Furthermore, if that professional relationship was ever severed without the execution of a proper 12-month transition protocol, all proprietary licensing rights would immediately revert to my private entity within exactly 72 hours. My brilliant corporate attorney, Richard Caldwell, had intentionally buried that specific, incredibly dangerous clause deep within Section 9.4.3 of the Intellectual Property Licensing Framework. Every single board member had eagerly signed that monumental document, including Julian's powerful uncle, Edward Croft. But I am getting slightly ahead of myself. Allow me to elaborate on exactly how a 38-year-old corporate executive attempted to erase me from the company I built, and how I ultimately walked away with $750 million while legally dismantling his entire operation. The Aeropath system was absolutely not just a simple piece of software running quietly on a dusty server somewhere in a back room. We are talking about 11 continuous years of hyper-advanced navigation algorithms, revolutionary radar processing engines, predictive collision avoidance systems, and deep machine learning models rigorously trained on over 2 million recorded hours of real-world autonomous flight data. Julian had scheduled a massive, critical demonstration for Thursday morning, exactly 3 days following my sudden termination. The Department of Energy had a lucrative $200 million contract sitting on the table for autonomous pipeline inspection, covering the entire southeastern coastal region. This represented the single largest prospective deal in Vanguard's troubled history. Elite representatives from the Department of Energy, massive petroleum corporations, and 3 different aggressive defense contractors were actively flying in to watch the Aeropath system perform a high-stakes live autonomous inspection of a simulated pipeline corridor at our massive testing facility. Obviously, I was not physically present for the demonstration, but Elias Romero, my profoundly gifted lead navigation engineer, began aggressively texting me real-time updates directly from the secure control room. Elias was a 31-year-old engineering savant with a doctoral degree in robotics from a prestigious technology institute. He was, without question, the absolute best autonomous systems engineer I had ever had the genuine pleasure of working alongside. His first message arrived just past 9 in the morning, noting that Julian was strutting around the observation deck, wearing a custom-tailored suit, desperately attempting to charm the serious-looking government officials. Elias frantically texted that the primary navigation system had just inexplicably frozen mid-flight. The massive drone immediately dropped into emergency hover mode, its rotors screaming loudly as it desperately attempted to maintain its position in the air without proper navigational guidance. Everyone in the observation deck was reportedly staring at the telemetry screens in absolute horror. 7 minutes later, the situation deteriorated further. The second drone flatly refused to even initialize its startup sequence. The primary control interface began flashing bright red warnings, clearly displaying a message that stated license authorization was immediately required and instructing the operator to contact Vance Autonomous Technologies. Julian reportedly went completely pale, his confident facade shattering in an instant. By 9:45, the highest-ranking Department of Energy representative was loudly asking if Vanguard Defense Systems actually legally owned the advanced technology they were currently attempting to demonstrate. I sat comfortably in my quiet home office, thoroughly enjoying a glass of premium bourbon while reading these frantic updates. The complex system was doing exactly what I had meticulously designed it to do. It was aggressively protecting itself from unauthorized usage. When I had restructured the massive patent portfolio 3 years earlier, I had intentionally built in multiple, highly encrypted fail-safes. The core licensing framework strictly required periodic cryptographic authorization originating directly from the patent holder. If the lead architect's employment was suddenly terminated without legally executing the mandatory transition protocol as clearly outlined in the agreement, all digital licensing tokens would automatically expire within a 72-hour window, forcing the entire global system into a hard-lock protected mode. There was absolutely no backdoor override, and there was absolutely no technical workaround. The encrypted authorization was quite literally military grade, because that was the incredibly strict standard to which I had built everything. Julian's reckless decision to terminate me had actively triggered this devastating protocol. Furthermore, his arrogant actions arguably constituted a severe breach of his fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders. By firing me without performing basic due diligence on the foundational intellectual property agreements, he had essentially rendered Vanguard's entire product line completely useless. It was a textbook example of corporate negligence, and the financial consequences were about to become apocalyptic. The catastrophic demonstration failure was merely the opening act of the nightmare Julian had unknowingly unleashed upon himself and his struggling company. What Julian had completely failed to consider was that the Aeropath system was absolutely not sitting completely idle on internal servers, somewhere waiting for a flashy demonstration. At that exact moment, the advanced software was actively managing critical autonomous drone operations for over 24 massive corporate entities situated across the entire country. When my proprietary licensing abruptly expired, precisely 72 hours after my termination, those active systems did not simply crash. They executed a far more devastating protocol. The complex software intentionally grounded every single drone in the air and permanently locked every single operator console nationwide. Suddenly, massive field crews, who had been heavily relying on our autonomous inspections, were staring blankly at completely frozen screens and angrily calling corporate headquarters, demanding to know exactly what had happened. Elias continued frantically texting me as the unmitigated disaster unfolded. Energy companies were reporting that their entire quarterly inspection schedules were completely frozen, leaving expensive crews sitting idly in their trucks across multiple states with absolutely no operational equipment. Major clients were rapidly escalating the situation to their chief executive officers and actively preparing to file aggressive breach of contract lawsuits against Vanguard. The federal agencies were even threatening to launch massive investigations regarding potential national infrastructure security concerns. Julian had desperately brought in two highly expensive outside law firms, and both legal teams were forcefully telling him the exact same thing. The underlying intellectual property agreements were completely airtight, and Vanguard was utterly defenseless. My dedicated director of operations, Elena Rostova, called me late that afternoon. Her voice was incredibly tight, strictly controlled in the specific way it always got whenever she was furious but desperately trying to hold herself together for the sake of the team. She informed me that the internal situation had devolved into absolute chaos. Julian was frantically attempting to shift the blame for the catastrophic system failures entirely onto the engineering department. He had actually placed Elias and two other senior engineers on immediate administrative leave pending a formal internal investigation. Even worse, he was actively telling outraged clients that the sudden shutdown was the direct result of a massive cybersecurity incident. That blatant lie made my blood boil. He was desperately attempting to cover up his own gross incompetence by publicly accusing my dedicated people of intentional corporate sabotage. Elias was reportedly devastated. He kept repeatedly telling everyone who would listen that he absolutely could not fix anything without the highly encrypted authorization codes that only existed securely within my private licensing infrastructure. Julian, however, stubbornly refused to listen to reason. He kept arrogantly insisting that Vanguard legally owned all the technology and that I was somehow illegally blocking their access. Elena asked me to help, but I had to explain the harsh reality of the legal situation. Any attempt by Vanguard to forcibly bypass my encryption or continue utilizing the software without authorization would constitute a massive, direct violation of Title 35, United States Code, Section 271 regarding willful patent infringement. The damages associated with such a blatant violation would be utterly astronomical, easily bankrupting the entire corporation overnight. Furthermore, Julian's frantic attempts to mass fire the engineering department to cover his tracks were rapidly approaching severe violations of the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. He was recklessly terminating dedicated employees without proper notice, attempting to sweep his massive failures under the rug. The following morning, my phone rang. It was Patricia Klein, the excessively cheerful director of human resources. She nervously stated that there had been some internal discussion regarding my situation and desperately suggested that we explore a lucrative consulting arrangement. She explicitly offered me $300,000, plus accelerated vesting on my remaining stock options to return for a 60-day engagement to stabilize their failing systems. I actually laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of the insulting offer. She nervously upped the offer to $500,000, begging me to be reasonable. I calmly informed her that returning would require Julian to publicly acknowledge his massive mistakes, guarantee total protection for every single engineer he had falsely accused of sabotage, and formally apologize to my entire team. Even with those demands met, I was absolutely not interested in saving a leader who clearly prioritized superficial spreadsheet metrics over the actual foundational technology that kept his company afloat. I abruptly ended the call, knowing full well that Vanguard's downward spiral was totally irreversible. The collateral damage, however, was heavily weighing on my conscience. Dedicated engineers like Mateo Vargas, who had just welcomed a newborn daughter, were absolutely terrified about losing their health insurance and their livelihoods because of Julian's reckless actions. I had intentionally designed those highly encrypted failsafes specifically to protect my intellectual property, but the immense suffering of innocent employees and the disruption of critical national infrastructure were never part of my master plan. I desperately needed a permanent solution that would completely rescue my dedicated team while simultaneously ensuring that Julian Croft faced the ultimate consequences for his breathtaking arrogance. That massive opportunity arrived completely unexpectedly in the form of an urgent message from someone I had not spoken to in several years. Sylvia Lynn, a brilliant aerospace engineer who had previously worked with me at Vanguard before being unceremoniously pushed out by Julian during one of his aggressive reorganizations, reached out. She was now a high-level executive at Sentinel Aerospace, Vanguard's primary competitor in the autonomous drone inspection market. They had been desperately trying to build a system comparable to Aeropath for years, and Sylvia clearly understood that Vanguard's sudden operational collapse presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She confidently requested an immediate meeting, promising that Sentinel was prepared to make an aggressive move that would fundamentally alter the entire landscape of the defense industry. We met for lunch at a remarkably upscale seafood establishment situated deeply within the bustling downtown financial district on a Wednesday afternoon, precisely 10 days after Julian had so arrogantly terminated my employment. Sylvia Lynn looked incredibly sharp, projecting an undeniable aura of confident posture, maintaining intense direct eye contact, and vibrating with the distinct energy of a brilliant professional who is finally thriving because the right organization properly recognized her immense value. Before I had even opened my leather-bound menu to peruse the selections, she casually remarked that Julian Croft was easily the single dumbest smart person she had ever had the extreme misfortune of meeting. However, she quickly pivoted, firmly stating that the highly complex autonomous navigation system I had painstakingly built at Vanguard was genuinely world-class. Sylvia slid a sleek, heavily encrypted digital tablet across the polished wooden table. She explained that Sentinel Aerospace had been aggressively monitoring the rapidly deteriorating situation at Vanguard. They possessed incredibly detailed intelligence regarding the massive system failures, the accelerating client defections, and the resulting absolute investor panic. She revealed a comprehensive financial analysis displayed on the glowing screen, clearly showing Vanguard's projected revenue completely cratering and employee attrition rapidly accelerating as panicked engineers desperately jumped ship. Sentinel Aerospace fully comprehended the underlying legal reality. They knew exactly that I completely controlled the foundational Aeropath patents through my private entity, Vance Autonomous Technologies. They understood the complex licensing structure, and most importantly, they accurately recognized that the core technology was worth significantly more than whatever Vanguard's heavily manipulated balance sheet had ever reflected. Sylvia boldly announced that Sentinel did not merely want to license the software. They intended to execute a full, comprehensive acquisition of the entire patent portfolio. They wanted to permanently combine my revolutionary navigation technology with their advanced hardware platforms to construct something neither company could possibly create in isolation. She calmly presented their opening offer: $750 million for the complete patent portfolio, combined with a rock-solid 5-year executive contract as their new chief technology officer, featuring a massive annual compensation package. The position guaranteed absolute authority over all technical direction, massive research and development budgets, and unrestricted hiring power. I sat silently for a long moment, slowly processing the sheer magnitude of the proposal. $750 million for the exact same patents that Julian Croft had foolishly dismissed as legacy software in a board meeting just last year. Sylvia assured me that their board of directors had already unanimously approved the aggressive acquisition, having planned this exact approach since the very day I was terminated. My immediate concern, however, was for the dedicated team I had been forced to leave behind. I asked about bringing my people over to Sentinel. Sylvia smiled warmly and confirmed that they had already fully anticipated that specific requirement. Elias Romero was situated at the absolute top of their aggressive hiring list. She firmly urged me to decide quickly, noting that other massive defense contractors would inevitably begin circling the highly valuable patents once the blood was truly in the water. That evening, I sat quietly with my incredibly supportive wife, Sarah, extensively discussing the massive ramifications. While the staggering financial sum represented unimaginable generational wealth, guaranteeing our family's complete financial security forever, the true value of the offer was the profound opportunity to finally build something extraordinary with an organization that fundamentally respected the intricate science behind the technology. The following morning, I contacted my trusted corporate attorney, Richard Caldwell. Richard and I spent countless hours verifying that there were absolutely no potential legal vulnerabilities. We rigorously ensured that the original separation of the patents was perfectly legal and could not be successfully challenged as void ab initio by Vanguard's desperate legal team. Because the original board of directors had unanimously approved the complex structure, years prior, the entire agreement was completely unassailable. Vanguard's licensing rights had expired exactly as the contract dictated, leaving them with zero legal standing to block or even delay the massive Sentinel acquisition. We finalized the immense paperwork, thoroughly satisfied that the legal trap Julian had blindly walked into was absolutely inescapable. Friday evening, exactly 12 days following my sudden termination, the doorbell of my suburban home rang unexpectedly. I opened the door to find Julian Croft standing on my porch, looking completely defeated. He wore wrinkled casual clothing, and his face appeared as though he had aged 10 agonizing years in less than 2 weeks. He desperately pleaded with me, his voice hoarse and trembling, begging me not to sell the foundational technology to their absolute biggest market competitor. He foolishly insisted that the technology legally belonged to Vanguard, because I had developed it while under their employment. I calmly retrieved a thick folder containing the legally binding documents Richard Caldwell had meticulously structured years earlier. I handed Julian copies of the complex patent assignments, the official board resolutions, and the master licensing agreements, pointing directly to the signatures of every Vanguard executive, including his powerful uncle. I firmly instructed him to read Section 9.4.3, the specific clause detailing the transition protocol he had so arrogantly ignored. I watched as the horrifying realization slowly washed over his pale face, his initial confusion rapidly morphing into sheer panic, as he finally comprehended the absolute magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. I demanded that he immediately offer generous severance packages to any employee wishing to leave, and surrender a comprehensive list of engineers I intended to hire for Sentinel. I informed him that he had fundamentally gutted his own company the day he decided a spreadsheet was more valuable than 27 years of deep engineering expertise. I was simply collecting the valuable pieces he had carelessly discarded. He eventually turned and walked away in absolute defeat, his luxury car slowly disappearing down the dark suburban street. The official signing ceremony took place the following Tuesday, exactly 14 days from the devastating morning Julian had so arrogantly fired me. Sentinel Aerospace's massive corporate headquarters, situated prominently within the sprawling energy corridor, represented absolutely everything Vanguard desperately pretended to be. The expansive facility was heavily constructed of modern glass and reinforced steel, but more importantly, brilliant engineers were highly visible, working aggressively in advanced laboratories behind every single window. Highly complex physical prototypes were proudly displayed throughout the massive main lobby, and genuine, groundbreaking technological innovation was actively occurring on every single floor of the massive complex. Sylvia met me in their expansive executive conference room, completely ready to finally build something truly extraordinary together. The finalized legal contract was massive, spanning exactly 61 dense pages of complex corporate language, but the core agreement ultimately came down to 2 monumental elements. Vance Autonomous Technologies was officially selling its complete, highly coveted patent portfolio directly to Sentinel Aerospace for an unprecedented $750 million. Concurrently, I was officially signing a binding agreement to become their new Chief Technology Officer, committing to a 5-year term with absolute, uncontested authority over all technical direction and a massive compensation package. I meticulously signed my name exactly 11 times across the various documents. Each individual signature felt incredibly profound, akin to finally unlocking a massive, heavy door that I had been desperately attempting to pry open for the past several years. Sylvia warmly welcomed me aboard and immediately instructed me to contact Elias Romero to inform him that his new position started the following Monday. The shocking corporate news broke publicly across the financial networks exactly 3 hours later. Major headlines frantically announced that Vanguard Defense Systems had officially lost its core drone navigation technology in a massive, unprecedented Sentinel acquisition deal. Without the revolutionary Aeropass system driving their operations, Vanguard was instantly reduced to being just another struggling defense contractor saddled with rapidly aging physical hardware and absolutely no software advantage to offer the rapidly evolving market. Furious investors finally realized, far too late, that they had been blindly valuing a massive corporation entirely based upon complex technology that the chief executive officer had never actually legally controlled. Julian Croft was forcefully compelled to resign the very next morning in absolute disgrace. The panicked board of directors hastily released a carefully worded public statement regarding a strategic corporate repositioning, but every single seasoned industry insider knew the unvarnished truth. The incredibly arrogant man who had foolishly fired me for being a supposed obstacle to his financial optimization had just spectacularly proven to the entire global market exactly how incredibly foundational the right technical expertise truly is to a company's survival. I called Elias that evening, and for the very first time in 2 incredibly stressful weeks, he finally sounded like his normal, energetic self again. He enthusiastically asked if the incredible news was actually real, hardly believing that we had successfully pulled off the massive maneuver. I happily confirmed the transaction and jokingly ordered him to stop calling me boss, reminding him that as his new chief technology officer, I was now technically his boss's boss. He genuinely laughed out loud, a deeply relieving sound that I had completely missed since the dark day of my termination. Within 3 highly productive weeks, Elias and 9 other elite engineers from my original dedicated team had officially started their new, highly compensated positions at Sentinel. Elena Rostova also transitioned seamlessly, proudly taking on the massive role of Vice President of Field Operations. Mateo Vargas happily accepted a senior engineering position featuring a massive salary increase and premium health insurance that immediately provided comprehensive coverage for his newborn daughter. Even my older brother, Henry, eventually ended up consulting for our rapidly expanding division on highly classified defense integration projects, bringing his 30 years of elite military intelligence experience to heavily fortify our autonomous systems security architecture. The massive corporate transition was incredibly smooth, far exceeding everyone's most optimistic predictions. Our highly anticipated new navigation platform launched successfully a full 4 months ahead of the original aggressive schedule. By our second full year of operation, we were actively managing highly complex autonomous inspections for over half of the major utility and energy companies operating across the entire North American continent. The revolutionary technology that Julian had so foolishly dismissed as mature and easily replaceable had rapidly become the absolute foundation for the next massive generation of autonomous infrastructure management. Vanguard Defense Systems officially filed for bankruptcy protection exactly 14 months after my departure. They desperately sold off their remaining physical assets to desperately pay their massive creditors. Julian, according to industry rumors, eventually ended up performing low-level management consulting for a small firm, undoubtedly advising other struggling companies on operational efficiency while carefully omitting the massive detail about how he personally destroyed a billion-dollar enterprise because he arrogantly failed to understand the critical difference between cutting costs and amputating the company's lifeblood. People occasionally ask me if I feel any lingering guilt regarding how the entire situation ultimately played out. Honestly, I do not. Julian foolishly believed he could easily replace 27 years of deep, hands-on engineering expertise with superficial budget spreadsheets and empty corporate jargon. He genuinely thought that publicly firing me would somehow signal bold, decisive leadership to his incredibly naive board of directors. Instead, his reckless actions simply revealed what everyone on my dedicated team already fundamentally knew. He was attempting to manage something incredibly complex that he had never bothered to actually understand. The single word I uttered in that opulent conference room was never intended as sarcasm or bitterness. It was entirely genuine. Because in that specific moment, watching his smug face, I realized he was inadvertently giving me absolute freedom to build the exact technology I had always envisioned.